guys. I'm gonna be talking about McCarthyism because that's the topic that I got. So let me just share screen here. Can you guys see?
Yeah.
Okay. So my topic is McCarthyism, and I'm just gonna start off by saying the basic characteristics of McCarthyism. Firstly, McCarthyism was a period of time known for its intense anti-communism, and it took place in the United States from 1940s to the late 1950s. And it was the practice of accusing people who seemed suspicious of supporting communism or of being communist. And it's also known as the Second Red Scare. You guys have any questions so far?
Yes, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
I was wondering why was it called as the second Red Scare?
Oh, it was called the Second Red Scare because something similar happened back in the times of the Russian Revolution. Remember how when we took the Russian Revolution, there was the Bolsheviks and all that?
Yeah.
And that event during the Russian Revolution where people had a fear of Bolsheviks and Bolshevism, it's similar to this um, phenomena in the United States where people feared communism. So that's why they're similar. So it's called the Second Red Scare.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay. And so now we know that during the Cold War there was intense tension and indirect rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, right? Okay, here. Basically, Americans started getting conscious and aware of the idea that what if there are communist spies in our community, or what if there are people who support communism and they are controlling our government? What if we become a communist like country because of that? And so this idea of growing unrest led to the rise of McCarthyism. Here, it shows that proven espionage attempts by the Soviet Union back in World War II increased the Americans' like fear and growing unrest. So what exactly happened during this time? Um, so right, I said it happened during the late 1940s to the late 1950s. But McCarthyism was named after Senator Joseph McCarthy, who is also the first person or the person who popularized the accusation of people who seemed suspicious of communism and being communist. So this is Joseph McCarthy. He was the one who popularized McCarthyism. And at first, it started with accusing government officials and then Hollywood actors and then common people.
Okay.
And that's how
My
basically, yeah, sure.
So as you said, the marketism targeted a specific people or groups, right?
Yeah.
Would you please mention them again?
McCarthyism targeted, like in general, the people who seemed suspicious of supporting communism, but specifically, the groups of people that it targeted were like government workers, government officials, and Hollywood actors, and a lot
Understand.
more.
I have
Yeah,
a question.
yeah.
If you were accused, what would happen to you?
If you were accused, you'd be jailed and taken away from your families, you'd lose your jobs, and yeah, even if you weren't actually supportive of communism.
Okay, got it.
And basically, McCarthyism grew so much to the point where people could be jailed for not telling people of the suspicious people. So that's why it grew more and more. And then the decline of McCarthyism began when Joseph McCarthy, the guy that McCarthyism was named after, he got exposed for the ways of accusing people openly without evidence, and that's why people started to lose trust in him. And once the growing distrust towards Joseph McCarthy began, McCarthyism declined and it got less famous, to the point where it's no longer existent after he died.
Um, okay.
And lastly, the aftermath of McCarthyism. I think that the biggest effect that McCarthyism had was on the accused people, because there were so many wrongly accused people, but only a fraction of them were actually communists and communist supporters. So that means that the rest of the people who weren't actually supportive of communism, they had their lives broken and lost just because of this wrongly accusation. And that's it.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah.
could you please answer my question? So, do you think that McCarthyism was helpful? And if yes, then how was it helpful? And if no, why do you think so?
I think that McCarthyism wasn't helpful because, yeah, like I said, lots of innocent people lost their lives due to
But
the,
they also one of like the prisoners were the spies were among them as well. So
yeah, for the most part, it wasn't helpful because a lot of people were wrongly accused, but a fraction of those people were caught, so I guess it's somehow helpful.
okay, okay, I understand. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing now.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Keara.
You're
So,
welcome.
okay, so I need to screen share. Can you allow
Oh,
that?
yes, yes, there.
So, good morning, everyone. My name is Gusti, and I would be sharing with you all today. Can you guys see?
Yeah. No, no, no,
Um,
no, no.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, now.
Today I'm going to be sharing with you all today guerrilla warfare in Latin America. So first, what is the definition of guerrilla warfare? Guerrilla warfare is basically it's a individual driven thing. It's not any part of big military. It's basically groups of people in the community that's taking action into their own hands. And the method of guerrilla warfare is hiding somewhere, maybe in a bush. And when your opponents walk through that area, you ambush them. So like you're taking them by surprise. They're not prepared or anything. You ambush them and you like basically hurt all of them and then you run away. It's hit and run. That's guerrilla warfare. And as I said before, it's mostly practiced with uh, people and communities not associated with any big military. Why is this important for Latin American conflict? Well, there's been a lot of guerrilla activity in Latin America during the Cold War. It's spread in mostly northern South American countries such as Bolivia, Guatemala, Colombia, and most notably Cuba. And we'll get into that in a second. The reason that they're doing this is because during the Cold War, the US wanted to spread their influence throughout the world, and that includes Latin America. But these people didn't want the US to be in their presence. So they opposed the US military personnel and like other US affiliated like groups by guerrilla warfare.
I
And
have a question.
yes, Kiara.
Do you think that there were any other ways to combat like opposing countries other than the guerrilla warfare?
Um, no, because well, in guerrilla during this climate, even their own governments like Bolivia, Guatemala, Colombia, and Cuba, they were being backed by the US. So you have a combination of the US military and then their own country's military. So you have to take action to your own hands. And in guerrilla warfare, the biggest part of guerrilla warfare is the element of surprise.
Okay.
Um, and when you're taking these militaries by surprise, they're not going to be prepared. You're bound to win. So that's why I think guerrilla warfare is more important. Yes, Farah?
Yeah. What do you think, in your opinion, is the importance of guerrilla warfare?
As I said before, in the Cold War, especially in Latin America, they wanted to oppose outside influences, which included the U.S. And as later on you will hear about communism being spread to Latin America. They want because Latin America has had a long history of being overtaken by other people like colonization and all that. They just wanted to keep any outside influence outside of their area.
Okay.
That's why like guerrilla warfare is significant for its purpose of keeping outside influence out.
Okay. Thank you.
And I've stated that most notably Cuba, because of the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution was led by Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. They were These people led many guerrilla warfare pacts, and that's why they were very impactful in moving their own political movement. As we've known in the Cuban Revolution, they were being backed by the Soviets. So that's like a conflict in the Latin American situation during the Cold War. They wanted to keep U.S. influence out, basically keeping capitalism out, but they were influenced by communists, and then they reinstated a communist government using guerrilla warfare. So that's a big conflict during the Latin American situation. And as we've known, in the 1953 Cuban Revolution, Cuba became a communist country and still is to this day, and Castro became their leader and the figurehead for liberation in Latin America. So what are their impacts? So the guerrillas were actually successful in keeping the U.S. influence out of their communist-backed regions. As I said before, many American military personnel lost their lives due to guerrilla warfare, because what would usually happen is, like, in a stretch of land, there would be, like, because it's Latin America, there's a lot of bushes, there's a lot of trees, and people can hide. And then when U.S. military personnel are walking through these areas, they're just holding things. They don't have their guns out, nothing out. The guerrillas will just jump out, attack them. They will be caught by surprise, and then they will die, and they'll just run away. So it was better for the guerrillas because they themselves only had few casualties, only a few of them got hurt, whereas the Americans, they, like, obliterated most of them. And they protected Latin American interests inside of their country while keeping U.S. influence out. So that's why they were successful. I've been Gusti, and that is guerrilla warfare in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I
Yes,
ask you a question?
Farah? Yes, Farah?
Yeah. So, do you think that the guerrilla warfare was a crime since they only lost little casualties while the others lost a lot? So, do you think it was a crime in any way?
I think it was definitely a crime in legal standpoint, because they don't have license, they don't have like any permission to attack the U.S. government, because it wasn't a formal war. It was just them doing what they want, right? So it is definitely a crime. That's why I think.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you,
But the
Gusti.
fact that they only lost a little bit of their men while they killed a lot more of their enemy, I think it goes to say that guerrilla warfare is successful at doing what it's supposed to do.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Can you make me the host, please, Gusti? Okay. So the Cuban Revolution. So first, who are the people who took a great role or like affected the Cuban Revolution the most? So in 1952, the former Cuban president Batista led a military coup and seized power. Okay, Fidel Castro led revolutionaries against the Cuban dictator Batista. Batista was backed by the American government, and after several attempts, Castro was able to force out Batista and his government, leaving room for a new communist government to take shape. Okay. So for how did that exactly happen? Okay. So in 1953, Castro organized a little band of rebels in Cuba and summoned a more group drive in Mexico. And Castro utilized his charisma and the discontentment of Batista's government to summon adherents. So Castro first gathered a group of 138 men, okay? And on July 26, 1953, he attacked an isolated barracks at Keara in the hope of securing more weapons. But the attack was a disaster and the rebels were fought back. Most of those who were not killed were captured, including Fidel and his brother Raul. Okay? The public trail of captured rebels helped turn public opinion in Castro's favor when he argued against the dictatorship and said history will absolve me. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but Batista was under international and domestic pressure for reforms and released the political prisoners after only 2 years. So Fidel and Raul fled to Mexico and regrouped again and did a secret group of revolutionaries. And an Argentinian doctor joined them. He's named Che Guevara. Okay, and then they start the revolution. Okay. So what was the cause for the reason? What was the cause, sorry, for the revolution? So individuals were unsatisfied with the debasement and the liberated of Batista. Batista had suspended protected rights from Cuban citizens and had utilized police constraint to startle the open. Citizens needed a government that regarded human rights and esteemed flexibility. So basically, they didn't have rights at all. So they did this revolution to get their rights as citizens. So here I have a timeline that explains the Cuban Revolution or what happened. Okay, so in 1952, Batista seized control once more and directs enormous and degenerate regime. In 1953, Fidel Castro leads unsuccessful revolt against the Batista regime. As I told you, he was captured, he and Raul. And in 1956, Castro goes to the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where he compensation a guerrilla war, the one that Gusti just explained. And
Yeah.
in 1958, the U.S. pulls back military help to Batista. In 1959, Castro leads a 9,000 strong guerrilla armed force into Havana, constraining Batista to escape. And Castro gets to be a prime minister. In 1960, all U.S. businesses in Cuba are nationalized without compensation. And in 1961, Castro announces Cuba as a communist state and starts to partner with the USSR. So let's go to the missile crisis. Here, there was a news, and all the people were frightened because in 1962, the world almost came into a nuclear holocaust. Sorry. Okay, so what is the Cuban Missile Crisis? It was a confrontation between the two major superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The standoff lasted for 13 days, from October 16 to 28. So, what was the cause for the, what do you call it? The missile crisis. So, wait just a minute. Okay. So, because of Bay of Pigs, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the aftermath of it, Castro announced that Cuba was a socialist republic and rushed into seeking an alliance with the Soviets. Okay, so this friendship led to one of the most infamous consequences of the revolution, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so and also was the Cold War conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, as I told you. So the Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba to threaten the U.S. It was like 90 miles from the U.S., so it threatened the U.S. a lot. Okay, so the major events happened in 1961, 1962, and October 14, 1962. So in 1961, the U.S. made an endeavor to oust Fidel Castro by propelling the Narrows of Pigs instruction. A gather of 1,500 Cuban batches were to launch an assault into Cuba from the ocean. The instruction was unsuccessful, and Castro inquired for Soviet after assistance. In 1962, in the meantime, Soviet Union was uneasy as the joined together states had set rockets in Turkey and Italy. And in October 14, 1962, this day, an American spy plane took photos of Soviet ballistic rocket that was being collected for installation. The photos clearly portrayed the medium range and the intermediate range ballistic rockets. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure, go.
What specific events concluded the end of the Cuba Missile Crisis?
So basically, in October 28, okay, the Cuban Missile Crisis came to an end when Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove nuclear weapons from Cuba territory, and Kennedy agreed to respect Cuba's territorial sovereignty. So they agreed to remove their missiles, and that's what ended the crisis. Okay. Also, of the intense diplomacy involved Kennedy agreement to remove nuclear weapons from Turkey also, which the Soviet Union considered a security threat.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Do you have any other questions?
No, you explained it well.
You explained really well.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Okay, so that has been it from the three of us. Thank you, everyone. See you next
Thank you
time.
so much. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any question, just contact us. Bye.
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 Guys, thank you, Gusti. Thank you.